The Bible is a book that is filled with both the ideal and the real. That is, you think about that, continually throughout the Scriptures, God lays down what He expects of us. He gives us, if you like, the ideal attitudes of our hearts, the ideal way of life that we must have. Therefore, He commands us to do many things. He commands us to love Him with all that we are. He expects that we will trust Him with all of our hearts. Us to be upright and to be honest in all of our dealings with all people. But we also know that God has given us a record in this very same Bible of numerous lives of His people who failed. And in that sense, the Bible is equal. You see, the God who says that we should trust in Him in all circumstance records, for instance, in the life of Abraham, a man who at times really failed in his trust in God. Instead of trusting God with all of his heart, we see him in his life at times leaning on his own understanding. The God who says that we must not commit adultery or murder records the horrible failure of King David in those two areas. The God who clearly says we must not bear false witness gives us the real picture of Peter. The Peter who lied. We can thank God that He has placed before us in His Bible His ideal standards. That which by His grace we can seek to achieve. But we can also thank God that He has given us in this book a realistic book. Are all too familiar with. Well, friends, we're coming this morning to one of those ideal passages, if you like. The virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. Now, a number of you ladies have, over time, mentioned that you would like to hear teaching and preaching from. So in seeking to be sensitive to the needs within our own congregation here and conscious that the teaching of this passage is very relevant to women. It's relevant to wives, it's relevant to mothers, but it's actually relevant to every one of us, which I trust we'll see. And of course, with some who I believe you earnestly want to know God's will for your lives, we felt constrained that we trust by the Lord's leading, that we'll leave Mark's Gospel for a couple of weeks and we'll spend our time in Proverbs 31. So at this point, I'm anticipating that there will be 3 sermons in this brief series, commencing the virtuous woman, a precious gift. And there are 4 areas that I'd like us to explore this morning. Firstly, her recorded life. Secondly, her rare existence. Thirdly, her rich value, her role and realm. Firstly then, her recorded life. Now as we come to this paragraph found between verses 10 and 31 in Proverbs 31, I think it might be helpful for us to understand that what we have here is as if God has got mounted in every room in this woman's house a video camera. Now, I know video cameras didn't exist back then. I said as if. And over a several-week period, God of this woman at day, through the day, and even at night. Every room there's a camera. Living room, kitchen, bedroom. And even when she leaves the home, as she needs to, there is, if you like, a roaming camera that's removed as she's outside the home in her activities. You see, when we read this passage, what we get, I'm suggesting, is the recording, if you like, of what a virtuous woman looks like in everyday life. You see, God could have, if He wanted to, in abstract terms. But He doesn't. If you like, He puts flesh on the bones to help us to be able to identify and enter in to this woman. In effect, God is saying, this is what a virtuous, noble, excellent, godly, beautiful woman looks like The thing we must understand as we come to this passage is this is the ideal woman. Nowhere in these verses are her sins recorded. We could say, if we want to just use the video analogy, the film was recording, and then it came to the time of putting that recording together. God deliberately edited out all this woman's sins. She's the ideal woman. This is what God wants all women to aim to be. This is true virtue, God says. For instance, let's just elaborate what I'm saying. That as we read this passage, and as you know this passage, there is not even one bad hair day for this lady. There is no one instance of tearful because it is that time of month when she's more emotional. No mention of that. So you know that's the reality. There is no mention of this woman burning the tea for the husband one night. There's no mention of it. There's no mention of her giving a crossword or a disrespectful word to her husband. Some ladies, and I know it's probably true for many of you ladies, read this passage, you've studied this passage, and you come away from this passage and you throw your hands up and you say, impossible. She, a woman. There's no way that I could be that. Many feel intimidated by this passage. Many become overwhelmed by the standards laid down here. And many could even see this passage and respond to this passage by being discouraged and disheartened. God is placing before us here His ideal for all women. God lays out His ideal standard. And the God who lays out the ideal standard is the same God who forgives us when we fail, as we all do. He's the same God who gives us the grace that enables us to be pursuing that which He tells us will please Him. So as we come to this passage, we must not think just of ourselves. We have to have God in the picture here. We have to think about the God. We have to think about the God who is gracious, who enables us. He never calls us to do that with which He does not give us the grace to fulfill it. This woman, her recorded life, comes to us very obviously as we look at the passage in a given setting. What was filmed, if you want to use that analogy, was a certain culture at a certain time. But it is her recorded life. And I believe it is a right understanding as we come to this passage to see that this woman was not an actual woman of history. I believe that's true to what the whole church. She is an ideal woman. And yet though she may not have been an actual woman who has a name, who lives somewhere in history, she has a date of birth and a date of death, though she's not that. And yet still as she's presented to us, she is presented in a very individual way with certain features in the context of her life, and who this woman was, what stage in life she was at, what station she occupied. If you like, what we're doing this morning is pressing the play button on that video recording and fast-forwarding through it, getting the bigger picture. And next week, God willing, we'll come back and we'll look more closely at some of the scenes. We'll look more closely at some of the virtues. And try and work out, who is this woman? Where is this woman? What stage in life is this woman? What station in life is this woman? It seems to me, as we look at her, as we look through this recording, she is an older woman. Or at least we could say she is a more mature woman. More than likely, what seems to be presented to us here is a woman who does not have little infants. You know, the only specific reference to her children is in verse 28. Look at verse 28. It says, her children rise up and call her blessed. Toddlers who are still learning how to walk and how to talk are not going to be doing that. So as we understand what's being communicated to us, it seems that this is a woman whose children are no longer small. She's at least immature. She could be an older woman, and maybe her children are not even at home anymore. Though we can't be too dogmatic. This woman is a woman who appears to be quite affluent. She doesn't, as some of you do, and I'm not criticising, this is a good thing, we do this, she doesn't shop at a second-hand shop for her clothes. Look at verse 22. She makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine purple. Now, in that culture, to be dressed in the colour purple was to be dressed as royalty. That was the best of the best. She actually occupied a position, if you like, of more upper class. I believe that fits the broader context. You go back to verse 1, see what verse chapter. The words of King Lemuel, that is, the utterance, or the very word that was given to him, which his mother taught him. This woman, in other words, was to function as the king's wife. These are the words that King Lemuel, when he was still a prince. And Mum said, this is the type of woman, Prince Lemuel, that you are to look for one day as a wife. She evidently, this woman, had substantial wealth because she could dabble in the real estate market. Verse 16 tells us she considers a fee. At the end of verse 15, in terms of her providing food for her household, it then says, and a portion for her maidservants. This woman had wealth. She was a woman of affluence. She had servants. Now, I think I'm acquainted with most ladies, mothers in this church. Unless you're hiding them, none of you had servants at home to do domestic duties. Now, maybe you might encourage your children to be those servants. But this lady had children and she had servants. This passage, as we look at the recording of her life, we need to keep this bigger picture before us. Lest we rush in and try and find something and then pluck it out of its context and try and apply it in our lives. We need to see the bigger picture. It's important for us to get that, as it were, that context as we come to this whole passage. Proverbs 31 presents the no mention of her faults, failures, or inconsistencies. No suggestion of her struggles, setbacks, and heartaches. Not one bad hair day. We have here her recorded life. This is looks like. Let's move now in the second place and come more directly to some of the opening verses and think about her rare existence. In verse 10, we read this. Who can find a virtuous wife? Or who is such excellence? Where are such women? King Lemuel's mum asks this question. Where is this type of lady? Who can find one? In our world, or today, this type of woman is the exception, not the rule. Who can find one? And the image, evidently then, as we can see, seems to be that of an eligible young man. And he's out looking for a woman. Prince Lemuel, if you like, is on the warpath for a bride-to-be. So look out, ladies. He's coming and he's looking. His mother's told him to look for a certain type of woman. What does she look like? She looks like this description in this passage. And as young Samuel goes looking for a woman to marry, he finds many pretty faces. He finds many girls who give all their time and their effort to their external appearance. He comes across many young women who know how to apply the eyeliner, who now know how to put them across many young ladies who know how to do up their hair nice, who know how to present their figures in clothing that would turn males' heads. He meets many intellectual young women. He meets many who have appealing personalities. Isn't it interesting? Not one word about her face, about her figure, about her IQ, or even about her personality. Not one word. But in Prince Lemuel's search for a woman like this one, he soon discovers that they are few and far between. And yet, let's quickly add something here, and yet it's not impossible to find such a woman as this. Verse 29. Quoting the words of the husband, says, "Many daughters have done well, but you, dear, excel them all." Now that word "well" in the New King James is the same Hebrew word that's used back in... He's saying many daughters have done virtuously. There are many. Of course, he's a biased husband. He says, "You excel them all, dear." But there's still a statement. There's still many daughters who have done virtuously. You know, Boaz found one, didn't he? Of Ruth. In Ruth chapter 3 and verse 11. "You are a virtuous woman." I'll say no more there and leave the rest of that for Pastor Harrod in the coming weeks. These words in verse 29 are almost like, "Son, Prince Lemuel, don't lose heart. You can find one of these women." And God is saying even to you, boys here this morning, you are the princes in your family, the princes in this church. God is saying, one of these women? Oh, there's not many of them, but there are some. Their rare existence. And what makes them such a precious gift is that they are rare, worth looking for, and they are worth waiting for. Who can find a virtuous wife? Well, we could ask the question here today. Who has found a virtuous wife? Have any of you men found one of these women? If so, then you need to treasure her. She is such a precious gift from God to you. It's very rare. It's a wonderful gift. You turn back, please, to Proverbs number 12. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 4. Again, the same Hebrew word is used here. Hebrews 12 and 4. An excellent, he says, is the crown of her husband. Charles Bridges, in his excellent commentary of the book of Proverbs, says about this, the wife, the virtuous wife for her husband, well, she is not a ring on her husband's finger. She's not a chain of gold. The virtuous wife, she is a crown on his head, his brightest ornament. You can hide the ring. You can sort of cover up the necklace. But everybody sees the glorious crown. If you have found one of these rare women in the words of Proverbs, and you've also obtained favour from the Lord, yes, such women might be rare, but by the grace of God they do exist. Ladies, young and old alike, tremendous encouragement to you today. With God's help, you can become a virtuous woman. Personally, I'm of the mind that God has been amazingly good to this congregation for a relatively small... I look around. I think the virtuous woman is not rare amongst us. Cannot we use, men, the words of verse 29, many daughters or many women here, a rare existence, but a real existence. The third thing I want to draw your attention to from this passage is her rich value, and of course those truths are very closely connected. And they're put together in verse 10. Come back to verse 10. It says, "For her worth is far above rubies. This is the type of woman under God worth striving to become, ladies. Her rich value. This is the type of woman worth being married. This is the type of woman worth pursuing, or worth waiting for. Because this is the type of woman who is worth more than anything money can buy. According to statistics from June 2005, 1 in Australians are millionaires. Isn't that an extraordinary figure? I had to check that and double check that with a calculator and with my wife's help to make sure I hadn't got that wrong. 1 in every 150 Australians are millionaires. We live in a very, very wealthy culture. Money and things are very important in our society, in our society's eyes. They hold great value. If someone's got lots of money, we say, the society says they're worth a lot. They're regarded as something that is worth achieving to become. We've probably all seen the scenes on television where the flashes are coming because of the cameras, the TV cameras are there and the red carpet's out there. And the women of Hollywood, media cameras. Why? Because of their outward beauty. Because of their glittering jewels. But God says, this woman, the virtuous woman, her worth is far above. A ruby is a precious gemstone. It has a unique beauty. And in the ancient world, they had a very high value. Today, the record price paid at auction for a single ruby, $1,860,000. This says, the virtuous woman, her worth is far above rubies. Not just one ruby at 5.8 million. Her worth is far above. You cannot put a monetary value then on the virtuous woman. She is far above rubies. Her rich value. And yet the Hebrew word here used for rubies could also perhaps be translated into English as pearls. Again, a great value, isn't it? Something that's a very valuable item in our world. It's said that 20 pearls are found in 35,000 pearl oysters, and only 3 of those are of gem quality. To be a woman like this, to find a which is of inestimable value. Do you see why I've entitled the sermon this morning, "The Virtuous Woman, a Precious Gift"? Those of you who know the love story of Martin Luther will appreciate this, and those of you who don't will appreciate it. Luther said this of his wife, and of course Luther had a very quaint way of expressing himself. And I quote his words. "Katharina, my dear rib." Katharina, my dear rib, is, thanks to God, gentle, obedient, compliant in all things, beyond my hopes. I would not exchange my poverty for the wealth of this world. Luther had he knew her worth, her rich value. Her worth is far above rubies. Can we not see here, friends, how radically different God's perspective is to women, to a virtuous woman, to that of what is great and ideal? When the world talks about a woman of real wealth, it's all about pretty face, it's all about stunning figure. It's all about her achievements in her independent career. It's all about her physical beauty, it's the size of her bust, it's the size of her waist. That's what else is on. But God says, don't be fooled by that. Look at verse 30. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is passing. But a woman who fears the Lord, she. Remember, friends, not one word in this description, and we'll come more closely to the description of the virtues next week, but not one word about her face, not one word about her figure. You see, this is not the Hollywood woman. This is not the woman's weekly woman, the godly woman. And who can find a virtuous wife? Her worth is far above rubies. We come then in the fourth place this morning to consider her role and realm. Friends, when we come to this passage, we must be honest with what it actually says about her activities in the home and out of the home. And yet, by the same token, we must not conclude certain without considering what the Bible says elsewhere about the role and the realm of the godly woman. You see, some of you will know this, that some people come straight to this passage and they say, aha, there it is. Here is the modern independent career woman. Look, she's out of the home working. She's into real estate. She's planting a vineyard. Ladies, can I just give you in passing a word of caution? Be careful, please, on the Proverbs 31 woman. And there are many books around it. No doubt there are some very good things in many of those books. But please be careful. Because some of those books come to this passage with too much of the world's preconceived notion of the career mind, come with those blinkers on, if you like, and they come to this passage and they go to prove their position from this passage. Be discerning in what you read. Don't just allow, they quoted that verse, therefore that's the end of the case. No, don't read one passage in isolation from the rest of the Bible. Your personal conclusions about mothers working outside the home. We must read this passage with Genesis in mind. We must read it with the Genesis chapter 1 and 2 narrative in mind. Remember what Paul says as he comments in chapter 11. He says, the man is not from woman, the woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Now, I wonder what's happening in your heart right now when you hear that. It's stating a fact of history. And yet our world hears that the woman was made for the man, and there's like there's an aggression response to that. There's no need to get upset with this. This is the teaching of the Word of God. Paul writes and he's making it clear what happened, what's laid down in Genesis. The woman was made for the man. He was made first. That doesn't make him better. That doesn't make her less. That's just how it was. She was made to be his helper. Genesis chapter 3 is clear when it comes to how and where the consequences of sin affected the man and the woman. That is, it impacted them in their particular and their primary role and realm. You remember? They sinned and God comes and He brings His judgment. On your belly you shall go. And He says to the man, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth. You're going to be labouring in the earth. You're going to be out there working the ground, Adam. You're going to be working outside the home. And that's where sin impacted him the most. To the woman, in pain, you shall bring forth children. Eve was to work in the context of the home. Family life was to be her focus. So as we think about Proverbs chapter 31, woman, we must remember So as we come to Proverbs 31, it's not going to say something different to Genesis. And it's not going to say something different to the New Testament. Like what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 14, where he says, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children. Nor even what Paul says, we know the passage in Titus chapter 2, where he says that the older women are to be training, they are to be teaching the younger women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, to be chaste, that is, to be pure, and they are to be homemakers. They are to be. Now you can do backflips and do whatever you want, but you can't change the language of what the words are. It's the word oikos, which is the word in the Greek for house. The place in which she is to give her energies primarily is in the home. She is to do good, she is to be obedient to her husband, but would not be blasphemed. So therefore, not to do those things as a young woman will mean that the word of God will be blasphemed. So as we come to Proverbs 31, we can expect to find that which is beautifully consistent with these other scriptures, because we know that the Bible nowhere contradicts itself. Come back to Proverbs 31. I believe the teaching of this passage helps us to see that generally speaking, the godly woman finds her primary identity and fulfillment of her primary mission in the home. Please look with me to the passage, verse 11, and particularly our focus is verse 12. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. For she does him good and not evil all the days of her life. In verse 12 then, she does, that is, her husband good and not evil all the days of her life. That is a summary description of the primary thing this woman does. If you like, here is her primary God-given work. Submission. Everything in this description, in this chapter, fits within this broad framework. That means never is she out of the home driving a hard bargain, buying and selling and gathering goods and even looking into real estate. Never is she into any of those things where she does leave the home doing good to her husband all her days. That's a helpful phrase. All her days. Not just when the children are in nappies, but all her days. Her primary focus is not her children, is her husband, in terms of the human relationship in the family. She was made for her husband. She is his helper. According to Titus 2, she is to love him. She should, and she will, if she's a virtuous woman. Friends, you look through the passage here in Proverbs 31, you even cast your eye just now down, skim through those verses. Notice how many times the term household appears? It's at home, out chasing a bargain, buying food, selling items. Never is that done in isolation from her husband. Never is it done in isolation from the benefit it will actually bring her household. Not a sell her own career. No, friends, this is not the ancient feminist, as some want to try and twist it and make it into. This is not some woman out there with a career, in the sense of which the world speaks today. Yes, she has a career. She's got a wonderful God-given career. A woman seeking to do good to her husband every day of her life. And as we say these things, let me just clarify, in case some of you are confused about what I'm trying to say. The issue is not whether this woman is competent. That's not the issue. It seems to me she's very competent. To get into the workforce, it seems to me she has many skills. The issue is not whether she could actually make it in the business world. And ultimately, the issue is not whether the woman should always be working in the home, should stay at home. Ultimately, the issue is heart. What's her focus? Is it inside the home? Or is it outside the home? Does she do all that she does with a view to submitting and serving her God-given head, her husband, or is she in the end independent in heart? You see, the godly woman is husband-centred, not self-centred. The godly woman is home-centred, not career-centred. Can I just say that notice that this woman does not view her husband, though, as her primary reason for living. Can almost idolise their husband. This woman lives to glorify and enjoy God. That's the primary thing. That's, if you like, the ultimate of the ultimate. And we can say that because of what verse 30 says. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but she shall be praised. So the most important relationship for this woman is not with her children. It's not with her husband. The most important relationship for this woman is with God. She has a healthy and a right relationship with God. She knows. There are times when you do things and your husband is not watching, your children are not watching. But a virtuous woman knows that someone's watching. She lives with the fear of God. She knows that God's eye is always upon her. She knows that what she's doing one day will meet her in the judgment. She'll have to give an account for what she does. She dreads fear in which she's cringing like a dog. It's a loving relationship she is in. Her sins have been washed by the appointed sacrifice, so that she has an ongoing relationship with this God. It would be wrong for us to think, and we'll come back to this perhaps next week, that here what God is doing is outlining, ladies, what you should do and how. And if you can just do that, well, then that'll be all sweet. No, the primary thing is your relationship with God. That you fear God. That's the core of all of this. That's the root, as it were, out of which flows all these other wonderful, precious, godly virtues. They spring from the fear of God. They spring from that love who is indeed ruling above all. So ultimately, put it in New Covenant terms, this woman looks to Christ. Her orientation is to serve Christ by doing good to her husband and being family focused. Well, friends, we've made a start this morning. God willing, we'll come back and take a closer look at those virtues as I've already said. We've seen her recorded life. We've seen her rare existence, her rich value and her role and realm. And as we conclude this morning, I'd like to ask a really simple question of this passage. Who was Proverbs 31 written for? Many of you want to say women. Well, it was written for women. I'm not saying it wasn't. But only women? This is not a passage that has... But in particular, is this not a part of God's Bible that has striking relevance for you boys? It is. In the very first place, these words of the chapter as it's outlined at the start are counsels of a concern her son before it seems he grew up. And we'll come back more to this next week as to why we could even think that. Effectively, Prince Lemuel's mother says to him, "Son, this is the type of woman you are to look for to marry. Young Lemuel, these women out there, you're going to have to look hard for one of these women. But go look for one. You can find one." You see, boys, teenagers, I want you to listen really careful to these. To pay close attention to this passage of the Bible. This is the type of woman, I'm pretty sure, that your mother wants you to marry. We could go around and ask all the mums, but I'm pretty sure this is the type of woman your mum wants you to marry. If I'm allowed to. This is the type of woman I want you to marry. Oh, that's nice, isn't it? Something more important. This is the type of woman God wants you to marry. His great goodness, He's given to you boys and teenage lads a list of what to go and look for in your wife-to-be. I would say to you, young boys, you pray and ask Him to lead you to this woman. I prayed for my wife before I knew her. Obviously didn't use her name, but I didn't know her name. You won't even know. Start praying now. Boys, don't be distracted by girls' pretty faces. You know, there are a multitude of young ladies, stunning figures, beautiful faces. Marry them. You will have a miserable life. I'm not saying that looks don't matter. I'm a male. I'm not saying that. But in terms of what is more important, the emphasis here, very clear. When you go looking for that wife, you ask the question, does she look like this woman? Does her life reflect this description? You know, besides your decision to follow Jesus Christ, no decision in this than who you will marry. And here is God in His great goodness. He's given you a list of who to go look for. Be wise. Follow the list. It will spare you much grief. Fathers, a list for us, isn't it? Isn't this a list for us? That we might know what we are to be aiming to do as the head of our homes when it comes to our daughters. It's not just fathers, it's parents. For us as parents, here is the list that we might know how we should be training and equipping our daughters for life. I believe our daughters should be the best that they can be academically. We don't know if our daughters will get married. And we don't know when they'll get married. Maybe, like Yvonne, they won't get married to their early 60s. Ought they not to be serving God with the best of their ability in the interim? And even if they do get married sooner rather than later in life, I would submit to you that an intelligent mother is a great asset in the training and in the education of her children. But as important as the academics may be, and of course they are fairly important in our world today in terms of employment and so on, we've got to be realistic. But as important as that is, we see this list as parents shows us the main emphasis doing. Or what we should be aiming to do under God and praying to see unfold for our daughters and for our sons. Close with a word for the women, young ladies as well. I trust it is the case that you earnestly desire woman in Proverbs 31. Don't be put off by the high standard. Remember what God's done. God has edited out all her faults, so that you might then be able to only see her good points and imitate all of them. Like you have to with some of the characters in the Bible. Good point, bad point. Imitate? No, yes. This one, you know, that's all I've got to imitate. All of it. No exception. Use it for what it's been given. It may be the case that you're not the most talented lady by IQ. And perhaps you will never win Miss World contest. But there is not one woman or girl in this hall this morning who cannot be a virtuous woman by the grace of God. Young and old, make it your ambition under Jesus Christ to be a virtuous woman. So much promotion today for our daughters. Be ambitious in the workplace. There's a place for that. But this is the primary perspective. You know, when that happens, you'll be the greatest blessing that you could ever be to others. And you will bring the greater glory to God, if by God's grace you are this. For the virtuous woman is a precious gift. May God raise up of such women, even in our midst. Let's pray.